Okay, everyone. Well, welcome to the this week's edition of the POLSIS Research Seminar Series. And this is a series for those people listening to this. This is a series in which we showcase cutting-edge research, either research that's done by members of the faculty or by research that is done by visitors who we've invited in to come and speak to us. And it's in that context that it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Charlotte Rommerskirchen, and I'm certain I've got that pronunciation incorrect, from the University of Edinburgh, who's going to come to speak to us about, in a sense, international financial governance, but with a focus on the EU. And she's going to speak to a paper called Riders on the Storm, EU Fiscal Policy Coordination and the Great Recession. So I'll hand it over to Charlotte.
That's great. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. It's nice to see so many new faces and so many as well. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here in beautiful Brisbane at the University of Queensland. What I'd like to talk with you today is about the main findings of a book I'm currently working on, and I'll talk for maybe about an hour to highlight some of those, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions, which I look forward to. So let me take you back to autumn 2008. Back then, commentators thought that Sarah Palin was the most preposterous US presidential candidate in modern history. Back then, policymakers, commentators in Europe also thought that there was not much to worry about. That what you see here, Lehman collapse, the largest bankruptcy in US history, would be something that Europe did not worry about. It would be essentially US casino capitalism that the EU particularly was immune to. Now, I think both of these assumptions in autumn 2008 can be now revised and probably have to be corrected. So the crisis, the financial crisis that quickly morphed into a Great Recession and that then lay the seeds for Europe's sovereign debt crisis, something that we're still dealing with today, not only caught policymakers off guard. They had no idea what was happening, or at least very few of them had, and if they had, they did not speak out loudly enough. So not only did it catch them off guard, it also caught them off script. There was no script for how to deal with this situation. The EU, particularly in the context of monetary integration, right, with the euro and the eurozone, the EU had guidelines and rules how to coordinate their economic policies, particularly how to coordinate fiscal policy. But that essentially concerned the coordination of fiscal constraint, how to make sure that members would not run high deficits. It was particularly a German demand at that time that was then enshrined in the Stability and Growth Pact. But there was no consensus, there were no rules on how to tackle a crisis that would probably warrant some type of stimulus spending. So back then, Europe looked a little bit different. Germany was particularly hardly hit by the crisis. What you see here with the Dachshund sitting in front of his bowl with all the export goods piling up, had quite a big slump, and that cartoon is from an economist leader who quite gleefully mocked the German model. And economists at that time said that, oh no, in the light of what is happening now with exports and what's happening with the recession, we need to completely reconsider what a strong economic model is. France was touted as a good example of a good, strong crisis-safe model. But by and by, it was clear that most members in the European Union were looking towards some type of Keynesian stimulus policy. Not only in the EU, right? This is something that happened across the borders. Interestingly, also now for the first time, something that emerging markets also took part in. Robert Stedelsky, who wrote a few very good books on Keynes, proclaimed that what we see now, what we see 2008, 2009, is the return of the master. And this is here the former Commission President, José Manuel Barroso, who tried to swear members to this grim necessity to swear them together that there would be some form of coordination, some form of cooperation, evoking the swimming pool metaphor of sinking or swimming together. this idea of, okay, we actually have no clue what to do right now. This is unprecedented, but whatever it is, we must do this together. Now, why this need for togetherness? Why this need for coordination? If you think about the EU, it becomes immediately apparent that the EU is connected, right? The EU is a highly interdependent union, so the need for fiscal collective action is simply due to that. In the literature, you'll find terms such as spillover, contagion, if it's bad spillover, or multiplier. So what happens in one corner of the European Union simply matters in another. And in that sense, then, if I, in this book, look at fiscal policy coordination, I consider fiscal policy to being either beneficial or detrimental to the provision of EU-wide public goods. And it's a type of twin public good in question here. Stability on the one hand and growth on the other. And particularly growth was the one that policymakers were worrying about during the recession. Now the classic or poor public goods is usually characterized by being non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So the consumption of a public good by one party does not reduce the ability to consume by another party. The good is in joint supply. One party cannot be supplied without at the same time simultaneously supplying others as well. A lighthouse would be usually an example that is given, right? So you can see it, I can see it, and just because I'm looking at the light of the lighthouse, it doesn't mean that it shines less brightly. Now with the EU, if you look at stability and growth, it becomes a little bit more complicated, and that is due to the different exposures of member states. So there are variable thresholds. For instance, not all member states are negatively affected if, say, yields in Greece go up, as they did quite markedly during particularly the 2010-2011 years, right? Quite on the contrary, Germany benefited hugely. Germany became the safe haven. So as yields shot up in Greece, Germany all of a sudden was able to borrow money at record lows. At the same time, stimulus spending in one economy does not necessarily have a strong effect in another economy. For that, it would matter how open the economy is, right? So how sensitive it is to what happens in other economies. I don't think that this poses a problem for the collective action framework of this book, as actually most public goods that we encounter have these kind of footnotes and exceptions and so forth. But it is interesting for the coordination problem in and of itself, because it means that member states have very different incentives, right? So the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union proclaims this idea of collective action by saying that for member states, economic and by implication also then fiscal policies are a matter of common concern, right? It's this common concern that gives then way for collective action. Now what I look at is this idea of fiscal free riding, right? So if you don't contribute to the provision of a public good, you are a free rider, you're engaging beggar-thy-neighbour policies. And for the crisis now, what is interesting is that for the first time, we have this twin concern of free riding. It's not only stability free riding, which was the overarching concern in the run-up to the crisis, right? This concern that, they're running deficits. But now you have a very strong concern over growth free riding, that member states would not stimulate their economies. So it's the idea of stimulating either too much, and you'd endanger EU stability, or you'd stimulate too little, and you endanger EU growth. And that is really a key moment for EU economic policy, because it breaks away from the singular treatment of fiscal policy, this budget fetishism that was previously enshrined in the rules. Okay, let's go back to the story. Back to 2008, when the question was what would become of fiscal policy during the crisis. At the EU level, there was a some would argue belated attempt to deal with the issue by putting forth the European Economic Recovery Plan. It's a plan that sought to convince member states that they should please. Again, there was a please, and it was very soft. No no harsh commitments. They should please stimulate the economies around 1.2% of GDP, 1.5% in total. Very cautious numbers, but no hard targets. But still, there was new. For the first time, the Commission, who previously had its role as saying, no, respect the 3%, respect the 3%. For the first time, the Commission came out and said, no, stimulate, this is a good idea. So for the Commission to come out as that, it was really an unlikely champion of deficit spending. Now, should one worry about free riding? If you're familiar with the public choice literature on the deficit bias of modern democracies, the idea that policymakers have an intrinsic bias to spend more money than they ideally should, one could argue that no, don't worry about growth free riding. If policymakers can spend money and even have a good excuse to do so, they will. That's the literature. But if you go then into policy circles and you look at the debates and you talk to people who were in charge at that time, you find that there was a really strong concern that growth free riding would happen. And to look at that, why this concern would be there in the first place and how it may have played out, I use in this book the framework by Manker Olsen, who's of course the father of collective action theory. And I look at the role of latency and I look at the role of incentives. Manker Olsen, he distinguishes between different groups and then looks at the probability of free riding depending on the group. And particularly here he points at latent groups that are very heterogeneous and where there's no strong leadership, either due to the makeup of the group or due to the public good in question. And he says that these latent groups are groups where we really need to worry about free riding. However, and that's the second part, even latent groups can be motivated to contribute towards collective action by the provision of incentives, separate and selective incentives. So I test his argument. The first step, I ask, is there evidence for high group latency? Is the EU a latent group? If it's not a latent group, one shouldn't worry much. If it is, then in the second step, are there those selective and separate incentives in place that may motivate group-oriented behavior? And if no, well, do we find any evidence for free riding? I do this with a mixed methods framework, both quantitatively, I employ mainly regression analysis, but then qualitatively document analysis and over 40 interviews whose institutions span the European Commission, the European Council, the European Parliament, member states' permanent representations in Brussels. So each member state will send people to work on coordination issues in Brussels, as well as the International and Monetary Fund in Washington. Since I'm interested in fiscal policy and its coordination, it is not a trifling question what is actually meant by fiscal policy, right? So how does one identify the dependent variable or the dependent variables? There's no real consensus what a crisis response actually is. What counts as crisis response? What counts as a stimulus? You'll find a nice chart by the European Central Bank that illustrates this problem. Start with the fiscal impulse. What does the government do? And then you can divvy that up further, change in interest rate expenditure, so that's how markets react. Maybe that counts as stimulus, maybe it doesn't. Automatic stabilizers, that's a really interesting one. So automatic stabilizers, they refer to the safety net that an economy has, such as unemployment benefits. Now, if an automatic stabilizers change, is that a stimulus or is it not? Fiscal stance, how does the cyclically adjusted primary balance, so that is the balance if you take away interest rate payments and you also take away the operation of automated stabilizers, how does that change? Probably you don't want to count measures here that were already in the pipeline, because those spending plans, they take some time to materialize. So if one member state agreed something in 2007 and then it materializes in 2009, does this count as stimulus? Similar thing with other windfalls, built-in momentum of public expenditures, of wages are set to rise and so forth. So just by looking at the fiscal variables that we usually encounter, if we look at reports by the OECD or the IMF, maybe that doesn't tell us the whole story. But I think what also is interesting in this context is what are the numbers that member states actually had? What are the numbers that member states looked at when they thought, oh, what should we do? But also, of course, what do others do? Are other countries complying with this idea of 1.2, or are they doing even more than that? A comparison here of different sources shows that there's really big disagreement what counts as stimulus. My favorite example is, do I have a light? No, I don't have a light. My favorite example is that here of Cyprus. Big 5% of GDP difference in estimation. And given this disagreement between official bodies doing the estimations, but also between member states, I think it is quite appropriate to take a broad approach and also take into account the role of automatic stabilizers. I don't know whether this is a debate that was at play here in Australia, but it's something that was quite prominent between the US and the European Union. Now, the US is not really known for its very generous safety net provisions. Europe, or at least some European countries on the other end, are. And when the US delegation and European leaders were negotiating, what should we do? What should stimulus spending look like? The US was very adamant that automatic stabilizers should not be counted. Right? That was a way for them to appear to be more generous and to be caring more about their people and having a better response to the crisis. Now, I find it unlikely, at least based on the interviews and maybe also just intuition, I find it unlikely that policymakers were not thinking about the operation of automatic stabilizers when they thought about how the economy and their people may be affected. Right? And if you look at the correlation here, the main difference between those two graphs is that there are different measures used to calculate automatic stabilizers. So to get to the automatic stabilizers, you will need something that is called the output gap, and the methodology to calculate output gaps varies quite a bit. And depending on which methodology you use, you will find either that there's no real correlation between automatic stabilizers and stimulus spending, or if you use the Commission's method, you will find that there is a correlation, that those member states with strong or substantial provisions in terms of automatic stabilizers engaged in smaller stimulus packages and vice versa, which would make sense, right? For the econometric work in this book, then, I use a centripetal approach. That's to say, I start with a very broad measure, that is just the budget balance, and then I narrow it down. Primary budget balance, you take away the interest payments on government debt. The structural balance, you take away the effect of automatic stabilizers, and the primary structural balance, when you take away both interest payments and automatic stabilizers. So in the first step, I look at group latency, right? Remember, according to Olson, we should be worried about free riding if we are dealing with a latent group. Now, just looking at the landscape of the EU, the economic landscape and the political landscape, it becomes immediately apparent that the EU is a very heterogeneous group. You have different political institutions, you have different parties, you have different, if you want to go a more constructivist lane, you have different traditions, you have different cultures, but also the economies, as I mentioned initially with the example of the German Dachshund, the economies in Europe were very differently affected by the Great Recession. They're more or less all affected, but to varying degrees. So that just as a starting point, that doesn't bode well for collective action. On top of that, what I think is interesting is to ask, well, do these features matter for fiscal outcomes? One would think so, but it's probably worth checking. And that's what I did here in this regression model, where on the top we have economic variables. So what's the economy doing? GDP, debt, the costs of the financial sector bailouts. They would also be related to the fiscal response strategies. The operation of AS, automatic stabilizers. So that's just the economy. And clearly what's happening in the economy, that matters across the board. Those are the 4 different fiscal policy measures that I take. But then you also have the political picture. Government polarization, opposition polarization, the left or right leaning of a government, whether an election has taken place. And here those mattered as well. And what I find interesting about that is that it suggests that fiscal policy does just not just emerge in a political vacuum, right? It's not just this harsh logic of economic necessity, but no, the political landscape mattered as well. Back to the fear then of free riding, that would suggest that, for instance, a member state where an election has taken place would be more likely to have a substantial stimulus plan, and vice versa. Or here, right-leaning governments were more likely to implement larger stimulus plans. So depending on the makeup of the economic and political makeup of a country, you would have stronger or weaker probabilities of free riding. So okay, that doesn't bode well. Second step, what about incentives, right? What about these Olsonian incentives to spur, to activate members to act in a group-oriented behavior? The tradition of EU and fiscal policy coordination has been to write some rules. It's a very German or the liberal idea. Oh, somebody's not behaving, let's give them some rules. It started with a famous Stability and Growth Pact. And then they realized that during the crisis they didn't really have an EU-wide rule, and thus they came up with this European Economic Recovery Plan. So in the first step I look at those rules and agreements. On the domestic level, of course, we still have fiscal rules, domestic fiscal rules, and then the EU level, the recovery plan. And what I find that is that, plugging again those rules here, I use the Commission's Fiscal Rules Index and a dummy for EU membership. So if I plug that in the model that I showed you here, I find that none of them are, the coefficients are not statistically significant. If I add other OECD countries, Australia amongst them, as a control group, it doesn't matter. The EU is actually not that different from other countries. The EU did not behave in a different way. Interestingly, neither is the Eurozone. You could argue that for the Eurozone those rules are more binding or stricter, and they feel under bigger pressure given that monetary policy is delegated, but that's not the case. So why is that? If we look at domestic fiscal rules, it's perhaps not surprising that they did not exert a strong incentive in times of crisis, because most of them have what is called an exceptionality provision, right? So in times of crisis, of course, you don't need to stick to, a golden rule or to a balanced budget rule, but no, in times of crisis, there are provisions for governments to engage in stimulus spending. And interestingly, even where those rules were not in place, notably the United Kingdom, government simply broke them. No, and there was no uproar, there was no outrage. That was considered quite understandable. Although for the estimation it raises a red flag, because the UK actually then has the largest drop of the fiscal rule strength indicator, despite essentially doing what everybody else did. So that's just a little problem with those aggregate with those data on aggregate rules at the national level. And for the EU rules, so the Stability and Growth Pact that was actually still working alongside the European Economic Recovery Plan. So you had a bit of a paradox situation where on the one hand the Commission came out and said, okay, this is a new plan, 1.2% of GDP, stimulate the heck out of this. And on the other hand, you still had the Stability and Growth Pact in operation, and they still went through the motions. They still opened the excessive deficit procedure, and they still said, okay, now you can stimulate, but at some point you need to rein it back in. All that being, albeit very, very vague. So if you look at the history of EU fiscal policy coordination and the repeated violation of the Stability and Growth Pact, it perhaps does not come as a surprise that EU rules in times of crisis would be ignored as well, right? In terms of fiscal policy outcomes, the European Economic Recovery Plan then was meaningless. Member states, they adopted the stimulus policies that they wanted to adopt. And there was very little concern or calculus for EU-wide goals. Like, what does my national plan mean for EU stability, mean for EU growth? That was simply something that did not take place. There was no meaningful coordination. As one interviewer at a permanent representation said, this plan had just rubber stamped what member states had in the pipeline anyways. That does not mean that the recovery plan was not a meaningful policy choice for the Commission, right? The Commission is not stupid, and I don't. Often, when you in this story, when you find that member states are behaving in something that seems maybe on first glance slightly idiotic, you look again and it makes sense. And for the Commission, it made sense to come up with this plan because it created this excuse for non-compliance with the Stability and Growth Pact. It created something where they could still go through the motions, as one interviewer at the Commission says, still go through the motions of fiscal policy coordination and keep up an appearance of normality. Normality in the sense not that economic crises aren't exceptional, but normality in the sense that yes, fiscal policy coordination is something that happens in the EU. Now this is what fiscal policy coordination has forwarded in terms of incentives at the domestic and at the EU level. But there's also another incentive, which is outside of the EU process. It's found in the form of market discipline. The weak coordination framework of EU economic governance has actually been designed with explicit reference to market discipline. The idea that, our internal rules, they may be weak, but there are markets out there, and they will go after governments who don't keep their fiscal house in order. And therefore also that's the result, and therefore we don't have to deal with that ourselves. Because the way that fiscal policy coordination is set up in the European Union is that member states need to coordinate amongst each other, but they also are supposed to sanction each other. This is what's happening in what is supposed to happen in the European Council, where member states would go together and they can vote whether or not to put a fine on somebody. Of course, that never happened, right? It was a German interviewee at the European Commission, and in German there's this nice saying of crows not picking each other's eye out, which roughly translates into there's still honor among thieves, right? So we're all crows here. We're not picking each other's eyes out. And interestingly, even now with the sovereign debt crisis, member states they're not reconsidering their stance towards market discipline across the political spectrum. So one interviewee at the European Parliament from the Socialist Party, she was very adamant that no, market discipline is something that we need. Market discipline is incredibly important for the EMU, the Economic and Monetary Union project. And what I did then here is I tried to quantify this. I tried to quantify the market discipline that could have exerted this Olsonian incentive for member states to act in a group-oriented behavior. And what I did here is something that is not often done in the literature, or actually probably never, I hazard a guess, done in the literature when you look at markets and risk pricing. And that is, instead of yields and spreads, which you usually find as those independent variable, I look at the interest payments by member states, which I think in this sense is the immediate punishment, right? Because of the nature of rollover debt, those high yields and spreads, they need quite a bit of time to materialize actually into larger government expenditure. So what ultimately immediately hurts is how much they need to pay to finance their debts. And that would be this variable here, interest. So the interest paid as percentage of GDP, and I find that this had quite a substantial impact on public finances. And interestingly, this effect is more pronounced for Eurozone member states. So the higher the market pressure, the higher the interest rates as percentage of GDP, the better the budgetary outlook. The less member states engaged in stimulus spending of one form or another. The problem here is that we're dealing with an asymmetric incentive. So, although, in contrast to budgetary rules or EU agreement, market discipline offers both sticks and carrots, right? So, if you behave well, here's the carrot, you need to pay less money. If we think that you're performing poorly, you need to pay more. That's the stick. So that's something that EU rules never did. For EU rules, it was only, if you violate this rule, maybe there's a fine. Well, actually, no, there is no fine because it needs to be agreed amongst ourselves. So, but still, on paper, there's just the stick. The problem here, however, is that markets, at least in the short to medium term, they don't care that much about growth, right? They care mainly about stability. They care more about credit risk. And that means that growth free riding, this idea that a member state would free ride on the stimulus of another country, growth free riding would not be subject to incentives, be it in the form of market discipline or in the form of fiscal rules. Which brings us back to the initial worry that policymakers had. What about growth free riding during the recession? So in this third step then, I test whether free riding was an issue. And I do so by looking at the notion of fiscal space. Naturally, how much you stimulate and how much that would impact then on EU stability or EU growth needs to be considered in relation to a country's fiscal room for maneuver, fiscal capacity, or in IMF language, fiscal space. So free riding, in other words, would appear to be stimulating too little despite your ability to do a lot more. That would be the accusation against Germany, right? Nobody accused the Greek government that they were not stimulating their economy, right? So this is about fiscal space. This is about a country's ability to stimulate. In the first step, I profile free riders. What would free riders look like? We already have this idea of Germany, and here I just plug in a few variables. The idea that large member states more likely to engage in smaller stimulus spending? And largeness here is taken as a proxy for economic as well as political clout. The idea that, oh yeah, they can get away with that. And secondly, I use a measure for openness, for the openness of the economy, because an open economy would be in a better position to free ride because they would essentially benefit from the positive spillovers from other countries who were stimulating. And here I find, if I plug that in the regression model, I find that there's no evidence that larger or smaller member states, that largeness of any size of any sort, mattered, but also the economic openness did not matter. So that seemed not to be an issue. If I take then some of the estimations of the, so that's just the discretionary stimulus packages. If I take some of the estimations of some bodies here who looked at the discretionary spending, and I check who was in violation of this very soft 1.2% threshold, I also find that it's not really the countries whom you would accredit with a lot of fiscal space who did not rise up to the 1.2% suggestion. To look further into this, I then construct a fiscal space indicator. To do that, I take a database by the European Commission, which has come up with a new procedures called the excessive imbalances procedure. And here you would have 11 indicators. They're the ones here. So they're very broad indicators that really map very nicely what's going on in the economy, and use them to construct a new indicator, which then allows me to ask whether, in relation to a country's fiscal space, it's stimulated too much or too little. In other words, are they in line? Is a country's fiscal space and its fiscal response strategy in line? Which is what you see here. Not all of it is, right? Some countries, they are here, they're down there. But I think what is important here is that the line goes in the right direction. The larger a country's fiscal space, the larger its stimulus, which is essentially what you would hope, right? In that sense, then, I find very little evidence for moral hazard-fueled fiscal policies in times of crisis, and interestingly, that is despite allegedly weak agreements on what fiscal space actually is. There's an amusing quote by an interviewer at the Commission who said that, we don't agree on the notion of fiscal space. For Finns, fiscal space is there if you can meet all your fiscal obligations for the next 50 years. For some southern countries, fiscal space is there if you need to spend more. So that's essentially the prejudice that you find in the media, and I find it quite interesting that this prejudice is also alive and kicking, at least in some corners of the European Commission. It's not what I found here. What I found is that countries had an acute awareness of their fiscal space and they stimulated more or less in line with that. So it's all well then. Right? This seems to be really good news, right? It's a feel-good story. There was no successful coordination whatsoever. However, they didn't free ride, right? No growth free riding and also no strong stability free riding. So sadly, I have to talk about the bad things, the negative side of this story. And to do that, it is useful to distinguish between second and first order free riding, two terms that are also found in Olson's work. So first order free riding is essentially what I talked about in the previous 40 minutes. First order free riding is just whether you free ride on the provision of a public good. You stimulate your economy too much or you stimulate your economy too little. That's first order free riding. And here I find no first order free riding. That's great. Or perhaps not surprisingly, right? In the words of one permanent representation employee, do you really think that the Germans needed any encouragement to help their automotive industry? Maybe not, right? The problem here is with second order free riding. The problem here is with enforcing compliance. I already hinted at the fact that this is something that the EU is not very good at. Instead, what is happening is that markets are enlisted to patrol fiscal behavior. So market discipline is attractive for policymakers who essentially wish to outsource the politically difficult process of peer review, of peer discipline. There were proposals to mitigate market discipline. They were all blocked, and quite on the contrary, Wolfgang Schäuble, what you would expect from the German finance minister, comes out in full embrace of market discipline because they tell government things that governments don't want to hear, and they force governments to do the right thing. It's not only the German finance minister. If you remember the quote from the socialist member of European Parliament, there is a broad coalition that is in favor of markets having this disciplinary role. And that the past and the current and probably also the future design of economic governance is surprisingly similar in that it relies on markets and in that it outsources peer discipline. And I would argue that this is irresponsible, particularly given the divergent trends within the EU. I talked about group latency in the beginning. Well, group latency is set to increase within the EU. Politically and economically, the EU is drifting apart. And with respect to events in the UK, it may even come to more than that. In that sense, I think it's politically irresponsible to outsource this. And particularly if we look at the role of market discipline post-crisis, I think we find that markets have become much more discerning. In the time of the Great Moderation, so prior to the crisis, when we thought that, if you keep your deficits low, say around 3%, if you keep your inflation levels low in the ECB, that would be close to 2%, then everything will be all right. So that's the paradigm of the Great Moderation. That has been refuted. And I would argue that for markets, that means that they are keeping much closer track on what's happening. This is no longer just the teacher measuring the skirt with the ruler. This is somebody who's going through the entire wardrobe. And for another project, I did interviews with bond markets investors, and one of them said, we used to be just economists looking at some headline indicators. Now we've become political economists. So they're quite interested in what's happening politically. So how to address this? The first is about first order free riding. One of the positive things about the experience of the Great Recession is that EU fiscal policy coordination is now really about both growth and stability free riding. That's a very positive development. And in that sense, if one would strengthen further the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, a procedure that is set up to surveil the economy in very broad terms, much broader, much more comprehensive than the stability and growth pact, that would definitely be a step in the right direction. Currently, the procedure is set up in favor of surplus countries, but that just from looking at the rules, it doesn't have to be so. The process is opened against Germany. It will be very interesting to see what happens in the next year or so with that. And of course, there's no reason why market discipline couldn't be mitigated. Eurobonds. There were one proposal that would essentially do that by mutualizing government bonds, and then you could find a threshold for bonds to be mutual insured, and then after that threshold, markets would be essentially free to go after governments. So that would be one way to essentially funnel market discipline to say, okay, this is off limits, this isn't. Unfortunately, Eurobonds had a very quick death during the crisis. Part of it is timing, part of it is narrative. So the timing is that Greece was the first country to need financial assistance, right? It was in Spain, it was in Portugal, and in that sense, then this enabled some European leaders, particularly the German government, to portray this as a crisis of fiscal profligacy, which it isn't. But if you do that, then of course, if you say this is a fiscal crisis, then the remedy is stricter rules and not debt mutualization. So I think what we will see, what we have seen and what we'll continue to see, is that there will be some form of debt mutualization via muddling through. Not the best solution, but still much better than what could be. But the issue of ownership remains, and with both procedures, the macroeconomic imbalances procedure and any form of debt mutualization, ownership matters, and that means that peer discipline matters. People sometimes say that, oh, the rules are stupid, or oh no, you cannot. That's democratically not legitimate. To that member states would sanction each other, would pressure each other. But I'm left wondering what is democratically legitimate about markets, particularly in the Eurozone, in a situation where member states don't have control over their own monetary policy. So about the book and its audience, and I'm very thankful that you let me talk for 1 hour about the European Union, despite being far away from it. In a way, I think this book embraces its niche. It is an EU topic, clearly, and that it deals with the legacy of the Great Recession and the future of economic governance and economic and monetary union. Luckily for me, I think it's quite a big niche, so it should have some space there. At the same time, there are some big themes at play in this book, themes that should be of interest to other audiences as well. Maybe just to highlight 4. The first concerns the relationship between markets and states, something that is intensely debated within particularly political economy, and has really been one of the major issues over the past 2 decades. Are states powerless? What is the role of markets to discipline governments, or can market power be harnessed to the benefit of a group? Fiscal federalism, right? So essentially the situation we have here, this collective action problem of members trying to coordinate fiscal policy, is something that is at play in most countries, Australia included, right? So I think in this sense then there are lessons for, but also lessons from fiscal federalist countries, particularly interesting questions surrounding no bailout provisions and moral hazard of spending, and the role of coordination bodies. So I'm quite interested in the experience of the Australian Loan Council. I think there are parallels for Europe as well. Thirdly, the question of international collective action. So EU stability and growth refers to cross-border, refers to international public goods, and given the interdependency of economies, there has been quite an intensified attempt to coordinate economic policies. The G20, a new forum that has emerged immediately out of the Great Recession, comes to mind here. And finally, there is of course an austerity debate, something that is playing out particularly in Europe, but also outside. So the question of what is coming of fiscal consolidation and who's the driver here. And in this debate, I think this book swims against a current that accuses the EU of essentially running this harsh doctrine of austerity, in that I find that actually EU recommendations and EU agreements are very soft and have been very flexible and accommodating in the past years. So the fiscal consolidation, the austerity that we currently see, is something that concerns program countries. That is, however, not the same as the Commission coming out saying you need to run austere budgets. in that sense, then, the EU is maybe not culpable of imposing this harsh doctrine of austerity. What EU leaders, however, are culpable of is that they continue to allow second-order free riding, and I think that will continue to be one of the big challenges for what is ahead. Okay, thank you.
Great.